Today's video is brought to you by Keeps. Now, what is Keeps? Keeps is a product that is totally changing the game in terms of how we treat hair loss. 2 out of 3 guys will experience some form of male pattern baldness by the time they turn 35. But with today's advancements in science and a product like Keeps, we now have proven treatments that can combat the symptoms of hair loss. And what's really great is you don't have to take time out of your work week and go to a doctor and wait in line and get a prescription. You can visit a doctor online at the Keeps website and find the product that is right for you. They'll prescribe you to a treatment plan, and what I really like is it's just shipped right to your door discreetly, saves you a lot of time, and it's super simple. If you look through the customer testimonials on the site, you'll also see that many men even experience regrowth while using Keeps treatments. Keeps has more 5-star reviews than any of its competitors, and nearly 100,000 men use it as their trusted hair loss prevention medication. Treatments start at just $10 a month, plus for a limited time, you can get 50% off your first order. So if you want to try out Keeps for yourself, go to keeps.com/Smith. That's KEEPS.com/Smith for 50% off your first order. Today's video is going to be all about the Ken Burns documentary Country Music that just finished airing and has been in the works for over 7 years. Many of you are probably familiar with Ken Burns from his extremely famous documentaries, including the Civil War and Vietnam and jazz. But a lot of you, given the average age of this channel being pretty young, are probably not familiar with Ken Burns, but he's an extremely prolific documentary maker. He spends a very long time making documentaries that are extremely comprehensive, and he spent the last 7 years making one about the history of country music. It's 8 parts, 16 and a half hours, and it's a real gift, I would say, to have this resource that really traces throughout the entire 20th century the history of country music. I absolutely loved watching this documentary. I learned so much. I had fun seeing the interviews. I thought Ketch Secor and Rhiannon Giddens and Hazel Smith and Marty Stewart, all of them just had such fun insights into country music and into the history of it, and I thought it was a total joy to watch. My favorite episodes were probably the first 2 episodes because they really were most of the stuff that I didn't know anything about. Not that I didn't know anything about it, but I just knew the least about the very early stages of kind of how the industry got built. As the documentary goes on, it kind of becomes more sort of mini profiles of different artists, and that's really interesting, but it's not as clear of a narrative as those first couple episodes. But I really, really enjoyed watching the whole thing. I'm just so glad that it exists. There's been some hemming and hawing and some people frustrated that Ken Burns left out one of their favorites, and I just think they got to see the forest through the trees here. One of the best filmmakers of our time took the time to make a history of country music. And in today's video, I just want to go through a few of the key impressions I had and things that I learned watching this movie. And before we start, just a little memo for the comments. Don't be a dick. You know, if someone says, "Whoa, I didn't know that," and to you, it's a really obvious fact about country music, just like, be excited that they now know it. You don't gotta flex on them and be like, "You didn't know that? You call yourself a country fan and you didn't know this one obscure detail from the 30s? Get over yourself. It's cool when we get to share something together. You don't need to act better than other people when we have this opportunity to be united. I kept seeing that on Twitter during the airing of the documentary, and it bothered me. All right, let's go. Number 1, Maybelle Carter is the most influential guitar player of all time. Now, I said in my video about how to prove your country street cred that I know about the Carters and I'm proud that they are from Virginia. It was very fun seeing in this documentary how important my home state was in the genesis of country music. But I didn't really understand that Maybelle Carter, when the Carter family first recorded, was 18 years old, married, and pregnant. And just her little way of kind of plucking and strumming on the guitar, which became known as the Carter Scratch, and has sort of defined guitar playing over the last 100 years. When I really stepped back and just thought about this girl from a holler in middle of nowhere, Virginia, was pregnant and married and a teenager and is the most influential guitar player of all time, I just kind of had to step back and really take that in and appreciate it with all the context. Next thing, Jimmie Rodgers popularized the yodel sound. Something the documentary made very clear to me early on was that Jimmie Rodgers is not really that talked about and that revered as a country legend, perhaps as much as he should be. He was really the first superstar, kind of like badass country rock star that the genre had. And his whole sound of yodelay-oo, yodelay-oo, that I hear kind of lampooned in movies, that I hear Sandy singing on SpongeBob, that you definitely would recognize if you heard it, that was really popularized by him, and it was seen as very weird at the time. That was a mountain hillbilly thing to do, and he was bringing it into country music. He was one of many artists that was portrayed in the film that died very young, but his openness to collaborating with other artists, his yodeling, and just his swagger is something that continued to reverberate through country music history. Next thing. Radio shows were the lifeblood of country music. I think in this era of streaming and internet consumption, it's easy to think about music being this thing that we nationally and internationally participate in at the same time. But before that technology, you were really relying on either hearing music live in a local setting or hearing it over the radio. So performers were often tied to specific radio stations where they would play their songs. Now, I knew that. I kind of knew the Grand Ole Opry would broadcast from one specific radio station that had an extremely powerful signal that could reach across the country. But I didn't really think about the fact that artists back in the first half of the 20th century were really kind of beholden to a single radio station. You would be hired by a radio station to be one of the players that would play there in your shows, day after day after day. So the Carter family for a while was stationed down in Texas. The Grand Ole Opry and WSM radio, which to this day you'll see those letters and it means We Shield Millions because it was originally a radio station set up to sell insurance. Performers would be contracted to them essentially to be playing their music. I just thought that was really interesting and it helped me really understand to this day the culture of country radio. Next thing. DeFord Bailey got screwed over. DeFord Bailey was a black harmonica player who grew up playing what he called black hillbilly music, and he became one of the biggest stars of the Opry throughout the late 20s and 30s, playing on their show, which was broadcast over WSM airwaves. He got screwed over in 1941 when WSM and ASCAP, basically a whole business transaction transpired where they said, you're not allowed to play these songs, you don't own the rights to them, and WSM fired him. The documentary makes it pretty clear that this is not really how a white artist would have been treated, and it sucks because he just ended up being a shoe shiner for 30 years. It wasn't until 1974 that he was invited back near the very end of his life to play again at the Opry. It is cool that they came back around, but it was one of many moments of racial tension that the film touched on. I know some people think they kind of softened the edges too much when they portrayed Charlie Pride and Farron Young as being good friends, or just with a little bit of talk from Rhiannon Giddens about the history of the banjo, but I thought the film didn't shy away from discussing the real racial injustices that were occurring all throughout the 20th century at all. Next thing. In 1953, Hank Williams had the largest funeral ever for an Alabama citizen. Hank Williams got a lot of airtime in the third episode, and for good reason. He's one of the most influential figures in country music history. But what I found really interesting was just seeing how beloved he was when he passed away so young at just 29 years old. Over 25,000 people, including Johnny Cash and Bill Monroe and so many others, came to Montgomery, Alabama for his funeral. And only about 2,700 of them could actually go into the auditorium where the funeral was held. Otherwise, it had to be broadcast on the streets because there were so many people there, because that's how beloved Hank Williams was. And obviously, the fact that he is still name-dropped in music today, the fact that Hank Williams Jr. had a prolific career, that even his grandchildren, including Holly Williams, who I love, and Hank III still have careers, it just goes to show how large his shadow looms in country music. Next thing. This is the one I should probably take crap for, but look, somehow I had never put it together that June Carter, that was married to Johnny Cash, was a member of the Carter family, like the original founding family of country music. Yes, I saw Walk the Line when I was 14 and I thought it was boring and I didn't pay much attention, so I didn't know that fact, but I was like, oh, the Carter family. So Johnny Cash had this affair with June Carter when he was married to his original wife, Vivian. He had this affair with June Carter. And when I was watching the movie and that came up, I was like, oh, duh. It was like when you're 13 and realize why the title of Blink-182's album, Take Off Your Pants and Jacket, is not just about clothes. and you're like, oh, I feel stupid. I shouldn't tell anyone that out loud. But I'm telling you guys that out loud to be transparent. It does make sense why the film spent so much time on Johnny Cash, because he has this connection to the original founding family of country music. He was such a star through the 60s and 70s, and then he has this career resurgence, and he has a child that finds fame through the later half of the 20th century, and then he goes and works with Rick Rubin. I mean, he's kind of this perfect bridge between all the eras. Next thing. Now, a fact that I did know, but it's too interesting not to say here, was that Merle Haggard first saw Johnny Cash when he was a prisoner at San Quentin. Johnny Cash very famously would play prison concerts for the prisoners, and Merle Haggard saw him when he was a prisoner at San Quentin. And what was really interesting was that Merle was in there because he had escaped juvenile detention 17 times, but was really inspired by what he saw Johnny Cash do up there and decided to follow in his footsteps when he was released from prison, and the two ended up becoming friends. And later in the movie, you see Johnny Cash on camera kind of put Merle on blast and say, yeah, when I met him, he was in the crowd at prison. And Merle hadn't shared that with the world yet. Johnny just did. But they had this level of realness in their relationship that even something like that Merle found a little bit embarrassing, they survived through. Next thing. Patsy Cline's most famous hit, Crazy, was actually originally called Stupid, and it was written by Willie Nelson. Now, I knew that Crazy had been written by Willie Nelson, but it made me chuckle a lot, the idea that it was called Stupid. It was also interesting hearing about the recording of this and how Patsy Cline couldn't get it right, and she couldn't match the demo that she'd heard Willie Nelson singing, but they finally got it right. It was a very kind of cleaned up Nashville sound, which had some backing singers and strings, but hey, it really worked out for her. Next thing. Chris Christopherson was a janitor. I was really glad that the movie delved a little bit into the career of Chris Christopherson, because I actually didn't know that much about his background. I had no idea he was working as a janitor, and I often forget that he is the writer of one of, in my opinion, the best country songs ever, Sunday Morning Coming Down. To me, it was really cool to see how much Johnny Cash believed in him and believed in his talent, and helped him believe in his talent as well, on the way to becoming, you know, one of the biggest country stars and then one of the highwaymen later in his career. Next thing. The jury's out on whatever Okie from Muskogee is about. Although during the Vietnam protest era, Okie from Muskogee came to be a sort of middle American battle cry for what was seen as anti-American protests against the war, it wasn't really about anything. And I thought it was, I mean, this is a conversation that's not new. Merle Haggard has kind of sidestepped it in his interviews, which are so charming, by the way. And it's just like, yeah, it just means you're proud of something. You're proud of where you're from, and you're proud of something. But the song was kind of commandeered from him and turned into this rallying cry. But there was something in people that really resonated with the idea of Merle reclaiming this term Okie, which was fairly derogatory. Next thing. Reba McEntire was actually a barrel-chasing rodeo rider. You know, I knew Reba was one of the big neo-traditionalists that came up in the 80s and that obviously has had a prolific and long career involving sitcoms and hosting and still music to this day, including a good album this year. But I really had no idea that she had been in the rodeo scene first. That made me chuckle. Next thing. Dolly Parton views her femininity as a strength. Now, this isn't some big, grand, interesting fact that I didn't know. It's more of an impression I had from the movie. I really like how the film showed us all these sides of Dolly Parton and how her desire to reach a bigger audience and stay true to her country roots has only served her over the course of her career. And I just want to read a quote from her that I loved, and I feel like it captures all her spunk, and it was probably my favorite quote that was in the movie. "I never had a problem being a woman. That's always worked for me more than it's worked against me. I always believed that I was strong in myself and strong in my work. I do know, and I have seen, that it can be a hindrance. But I'm not offended by all the dumb blonde jokes, because I'm not dumb. And I'm not blonde either." How charming can one person be, you know? I love Dolly, and I thought she was such a good interview all throughout the movie, too. Next thing. The internal debates about the sound and authenticity of country music are nothing new. This is going to be the last thing I talk about because it was probably the biggest takeaway in the movie to me, was just that this sort of internal discourse within country music about does this sound country or not? Is this guy really country or not? Was a theme that kept getting brought up throughout the film. When the Nashville sound really embraced like strings and backing choruses. Well, then out of Texas comes this honky-tonkier sound. You get the outlaw movement and guys like Willie that are sort of reacting to that. Similarly, when in the 80s, or like 70s and 80s, when Olivia Newton-John is winning awards and John Denver is winning CMA awards, you get this kind of neo-traditional movement in response to that. And this has been happening all through the history of country music. And the musicians themselves are quite open to collaborating with other artists. They just want to make great music, and the genre has a way of regulating itself. I felt really stretched by that as someone that feels really passionately and for the last decade has really sort of fought to bring country music back to its roots. Sometimes talking a little bit out of my ass, I felt really affected by the way that the film sort of suggests, yeah, that's normal. You're not crazy. This has happened for all of history. And at the same time, chill out, you know? The music does change, and at the same time, it always comes back. People like what is in this sound of country music, and they even like to be mad when it doesn't sound like that, and they even like to stretch it and be a little bit naughty and change what the sound of it is. I don't know if you guys experienced the same thing. It made me feel, in some ways, less valid in my criticisms of Nashville over the last decade. And at the same time, it made me feel more valid in my criticism because you're like, yeah, I'm listening to all this music that's true and good, and that's not where country music has been. I really felt a major parallel between the 80s as it was represented in the Ken Burns film and the 2010s as they have been. And now I'm looking at, the class of 2019 and how we're getting this kind of neo-traditional movement, and it's really reminding me of 30 years before the class of 89, when this is kind of where the film ends, with the Randy Travises and Alan Jacksons of the world kind of rising up and wanting to swing things back into country and bring the fiddle back in and bring the steel back in and get away from the popification of the sound. I'm going to have to be thinking about it and processing it for a while, because I just thought that was a super interesting aspect of the film. I would love to know your guys' thoughts on Ken Burns' film. I just thought it was so cool. I'm so glad we have this resource. I know that this video isn't comprehensive. I'm trying to take a 16.5-hour documentary and turn it into something a little more digestible for the people that might not watch it otherwise. But if you want to watch it, you can do it for free. It's all on pbs.org. I wish I had the poster that I have, a signed poster from Ken Burns that his team sent to me. I wish I had that so I could show it in the video, but I don't. But anyway, let me know your guys' thoughts on the film. Let me know some of the big takeaways that you had. And yeah, give this video a like, subscribe if you haven't already. I talk about country music on this channel, and I appreciate you guys watching. Bye.